Thank you for joining us. My name is Victor, and I am a librarian with the Youth Services Department here at Sacramento Public Library. We are very excited to welcome you to the STEAM Youth Leadership Program series. This program is funded by the California State Library Stronger Together initiative. The Library of Congress 2022 National Book Festivity Authors page mentioned that Darcie Little Badger is a Lipan Apache writer with a doctorate in oceanography. Her debut novel, Elazzo, was featured in Time magazine as one of the best 100 fantasy novels of all time. Her works comprise short fiction, nonfiction, and comics that have appeared in multiple magazines and publications. Her books have won Nebula Award, Newbery Honor, Ignite Award, and Locus Award for Best First Novel, among other awards. Darcie Little Badger About Me page also mentioned that she holds a BA in Geosciences from Princeton University and a PhD in Oceanography from Texas A&M University. Darcie, thank you for joining us today. I would like to introduce you to our cohort members, Hector, Oliver, and Rosa, who are ready to start a conversation with you about your personal journey as a Black, Indigenous, and Latinx STEM professional. Go ahead.
Hello, Darcie Little Badger. It's nice to meet you. By the way, I noticed the hair is really cool. It reminds me
Hello.
of a fox. It's really
Yeah.
cool. I like it a lot.
So I
But
have quite a few wings.
I want to start off by asking, what would you be comfortable with us calling you by?
Oh yeah, you can call me Darcie or really,
Darcie.
yeah, really anything.
Okay then, sounds good. And so just to recapitalize on what Victor was saying, is there something you want to tell us about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I guess one thing I can say is so in the year 2020, I actually transitioned from working. At that point, I was a scientific editor. But my first book had just been published, and I was able to support myself just writing books. So as of 2020, I've been a full-time writer. But I like to still, like, even though I don't get a salary from it, I do like to stay involved in really anything where my background in earth sciences, especially as it relates to uh, the state of Texas and and the land and, like, the Gulf of Mexico and just that region. I like to kinda stay involved just so that all that I've learned can still help people. It's just no longer my career. It kinda makes me sad sometimes, but I just didn't have enough time for 2 jobs.
Okay, that's very interesting, actually. So why is it like Texas and the Gulf of Mexico that you're more interested on?
Yeah, so I am Lipon Apache, and I say that that's from my maternal side. On my father's side, they're Irish American, but strangely, both sides of my family's in Texas. It's just on my mom's side, we've been there really for centuries. So the Lipon Apache, our homeland, our traditional homeland, is what's now considered throughout Texas and also northern Mexico. So we were there before the border was put into place, and in fact, if you go back and look at the history, especially during the 1700s and 1800s, the Lipan Apache were very much involved in the politics of the region. It's actually pretty complicated, and I am not a historian, so I usually don't get into it. But it's definitely where I consider my home. It's where my family considers home, and it's where a lot of the stories of the family that came before me, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and going back, it's what they considered home. So I'm intimately familiar with the region, and I also did my research there at Texas A&M. We looked at a species of plankton that does red tides, Karenia brevis, and they form these red tides in the Gulf of Mexico. So you see like these red tides happen almost annually off of Florida, and we say semi-annually, like maybe every other year off of Texas. It's not entirely predictable. But that was something that the lab I worked with was trying to do is to trying to have early warning systems by using imaging flow cytometry to look at plankton cells. And once you start seeing more of these plankton cells, the Karenia brevis, they're like, okay, well maybe red tide is about to happen. And I specifically looked at the genetics of these guys. So it's both where I'm familiar based on my academic background, but also my personal history.
That's very interesting, and I really like how you're involved and you still know a lot about Lupin Apache. So how would you describe the structure and function of Lupin Apache storytelling as well as what it is?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I kind of say I was told stories in a couple of different ways. First, my parents did read me picture books. So I had that was the one thing that my room was always filled with books. And I was just so fortunate that I had that growing up. But also, so the Lipon Apache and this is the same with a lot of Native peoples throughout the United States, not just the Lipon, but we have a really strong oral storytelling tradition. And especially if you go back far enough, we didn't write these stories down. We would tell them to each other and just pass it on that way. So my mom, she told me stories that sometimes they were adventurous and they were fun, and they were stories of tricksters or heroes. But she'd also tell me stories that were a way to kind of convey our ceremonies. And, she'd tell me stories about my family and what they went through. So I'd say that oral storytelling component, it's very strong and it's very beautiful. But it also can sometimes be difficult because when the people who tell the stories are no longer with us, through the Lipon Apache had a very difficult time. At one point, both Mexico and the United States had extermination campaigns against us. So some of those, unfortunately, have been lost. So it just really highlights the importance of passing down these cultural. It's because stories are so much more than just entertainment. They are knowledge. They're just so very important. So I grew up with that in mind as I was a kid, just the importance of stories in general and all different types of varieties of them. And yeah, I guess that's a kind of roundabout way of saying that.
Touched on how you heard a lot of stories when you were young. When did you start telling your own stories, or to the people around you?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to be a writer before I could write, and there's still a couple of pieces of construction paper. Like my mom has boxes of our old childhood drawings and stuff, so I would scribble on this paper because I would see my parents reading me from books, and I was like, okay, so that's what words look like, but I didn't know how to write the words yet. So the older I got, the more I learned the alphabet and how to spell and grammar and things like that, the more I honed my craft. And I'd say that my first book I wrote when I was 7. It actually took a little longer than a year, so I'd say 7, 8. It was a 40-page mystery that I wrote on my parents' very very old-fashioned computer, because this was the early 90s, well, mid 90s. So our computer was good for word processing, and then we also played Tetris on it. So there wasn't a lot compared to today's, we have laptops now, and that was we had a desktop and just one, and the whole family used it. But I wrote this book and printed it out on our printer, and my dad taught me how to edit my own work, which I say is very important, something that writers should learn. And not just writers, if you're a scientist and you are writing a scientific paper, that has to go through a lot of edits, first of all, with you and maybe your principal investigator, but then you send it off to get peer reviewed, and a lot of editing involved with that too. So it's important to learn how to manage that and to recognize that it's an important step. It's not saying that you're bad just because you have to change things. But yeah, I edited that book. I sent it off to the publisher, Houghton Mifflin, and they sent me back a rejection. But I'd say that is my first real step into becoming a published author, because that rejection kind of lit a fire under me, and I wanted to keep doing this and telling stories and contributing to all of these books and other forms of media like comics and even television. Someone has to write that. I wanted to help make the world a lot more fun for other people too.
Through your novels, definitely, they're really good, and you're able to see through a different perspective and a different world. And I know that you did really good with the novel Alazzo and A Snake Falls to Earth. They were really really good. And would you say that they're based off of personal experience?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring this question up, because my third book, it's called Shene Lende, and it's actually a prequel to Latsoe, except it takes place in the 1970s, and it tells the story of the main character, Ellie, her grandmother. So when she was a teenager in 1970s Texas. And that book, more than anything, I think, incorporated some real historical events. So this is a fantasy book, so not everything is historical. But I did look at the events in Texas that were really affecting my family and other Lipan people in McAllen, which is this city on the border where a lot of my family lives. And one of those events was Hurricane Beulah, which took place in 1967, so a little bit before the 70s, but it ended up just being devastating. Like you can Google it. There's actually a lot of images online that just show the flood damage, and a lot of this flood damage, I mean, everywhere was flooding, but there were some really severe concentrations of damage in communities that did not have a lot in the terms of infrastructure and economic power. These included communities of people who'd immigrated from Mexico, but also communities of Native peoples, Lipan peoples, and my family was part of that. So when I was writing Shenelende, I was really thinking about how that impacted us and other members of our and connected communities, and putting this into the book. And I think that a lot of times when people write fantasy and science fiction, these speculative genres are a great way to kind of portray a lot of issues that affect the here and now, but to do it in a way that can use like maybe symbolism in creative ways. And for me, it also makes it a little bit less painful because it is almost a step removed from what actually happened to my family. And yet it is also it is also true to the suffering and then ultimately the triumph of those who survived. So yeah, in little ways, I find myself being influenced by things not just that happened to my personal, like me, Darcie, but also that happened to the people I care about and I love. And which is pretty cool, like talking about how you can use science fiction and fantasy to do that type of stuff.
I find it very interesting that it seems to me like you carry a lot of pain with you about everything that happened to your family in Texas and all that. And so I really want to ask, is there any pain that you carry when you write these books? Is there a message you want to give to change people's minds about the mistreatment of Native American people in the US?
Yeah, and it's I would say that the one theme that I keep returning to in all of my books and in most of my stories, I write a lot of short stories too, but it's this theme of hope, especially hope in light of odds that are stacked against you. And I think this does apply to Native peoples in the US, but also a lot of different other groups that are in some way marginalized or mistreated or experience injustices. So I think it's a theme that a lot of people can benefit from. And I kind of go back to, so the Lipan Apache, we're interesting because we don't have a reservation, and for a lot of time, essentially Texas considered it briefly, and then we were fighting too hard against them, and they're like, okay, this is not an option, so let's just get rid of them instead. So a lot of our land, for example, my grandma's 14 acres that she lived on since Hurricane Beulah, essentially. Like she moved to this land and she made it her home for many decades. And when she passed away, we could not afford to maintain this land anymore. So I remember at that moment when I realized it was going to have to be given away and parceled up, essentially, because this is in McAllen. So I believe that people bought it for other houses. I thought for a moment, I was like, well, maybe we'll never have our land back. And that was a moment of despair. But then a couple years later, something incredible happened. Texas, specifically Presidio, which is this town down on the border as well, they gave my tribe back one of our sacred burial grounds. And we're in the process of, we've blessed it. We've basically spruced it up, cleaned it up. We're putting a nice, like, pretty little wall around it so that people know where it is, but also information so they can read about the importance of this land. We're doing things like ground surveys because Lipan people traditionally didn't mark where we buried ours. So there's a lot of potential graves that don't have any stones on them. Like some of them do, but those tend to be the later ones. So we're looking for how extensive this burial ground is and finding some interesting things. And what this showed me was that the people who had been fighting for a very long time, they accomplished something that I, in my darkest moment, thought that, it would never. Texas doesn't like to like to concede anything to the native peoples who lived there, and yet it did. So that just showed me that there is hope. And the danger to giving in to despair is that you don't then put that effort to fight for a better future, not just for yourself, but also the people younger than you and people who haven't even been born yet, generations who will come after you. And so I do keep returning to hope. And a lot of my books deal with issues of finding justice for family members and things like that. And I think it's because I want to envision a world where that is possible for them, is kind of a hoping that it will inspire other people to work for a world where it's possible for future generations. So yeah, it can be sometimes discouraging, but then also you just have to celebrate whatever victories that you get, and acknowledge the hard work of the people who are supporting those victories.
Very, very thoughtful response. I love that
To
to hear about hope, especially because hope does have a lot to do with
Mhm.
all of us, no matter where we come from or what our challenges are. And so, one last question before I let one of my partners take it off is that I know that Apache is like very like spiritual and all that. Is there an element of that in your life, and how has that like affected you?
Yeah, I definitely. So I'm a little bit less. I would say that the scientist part of me is always like questioning everything. But then I have my mother who has really impressed upon me the importance of a lot of our ceremonies. And something that I've realized is, for example, my great great grandpa, and this is a cool story because it kind of shows the importance of oral storytelling. In the morning, he would go outside and he'd say this. I'm going to use the word prayer. I guess that's the closest that you can get to it, but he'd speak to the sun every morning, and he'd say this in Lipan. And my great great grandparents, that was the last line of like fluent Lipan speakers. After that, my great grandmother knew Lipan, but mostly spoke Spanish. My grandmother knew a lot less Lipan, spoke Spanish, and later in her life learned English. And my mother spoke Spanish, then learned English, and knew the least Lipan of all. But this prayer that my great great grandfather would said was actually passed on, um, complete enough, or it essentially the words, the sounds were whole enough that we were able to interpret everything very recently. So now we know what he said. And something I think is really cool is just the importance of the sun as a figure, in our, I guess, understanding of the world. And also because like it's not actually, I don't think God is the right word for it. We don't really have gods, but we have these figures that are spiritually important, and I would say legendary and immortal. And the sun is one of those. And as a scientist, especially someone who studied phytoplankton, which are these photosynthesizers, and learning about how atmospheric circulation really relies on the sun, and the sun is everything. And I'm thinking, wow, so I guess even back then, like people really acknowledged the importance of sun in life. And so I think that being a scientist and learning about how the natural world works, and then combining that with a lot of our stories and our ceremonies, and I do find that I appreciate them a lot more. So I would say that's where that comes from with me. There are some people who are a lot more, like my mother, for one, who are a lot more in tune to that. But I'm trying my best.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So like, as Victor said earlier, your books have like become really successful. So I think this is a great opportunity to touch on some advice that you'd have for young writers who are aspiring to become a storyteller just like you. So my first question is, what type of qualities that you have do you think that make you a successful writer and a good storyteller?
Well, I would say that my biggest quality that if I can say anything that you take away from this interview, especially this question, is the importance of perseverance when it comes to pursuing your dream, whatever that might be, whether it's a creative type of pursuit like becoming a writer, or maybe you want to be, I don't know, a computer programmer, really anything. In particular with writing, there's a lot of rejection. And that's something that can hurt a lot if you don't realize that this is part of the process, and it doesn't mean that you're not talented or that you're a bad writer. So my biggest quality that has helped me come this far, I think, is that I don't give up, and I don't let rejection make me feel bad about myself. Like I don't know. I've always been fortunate to have parents who supported my dreams and who said that, I'm smart, I can do it. And some people don't have that. So I am privileged that I did have that. And I think it gave me a lot of confidence. Let's go with confidence. So yeah, I actually was submitting stories to sci-fi magazines for over 10 years before I got my first book published. I did end up being a scientist too. There's a whole story about how I wanted to study creative writing when I was an undergrad, and the creative writing department rejected me twice. So I decided to become an oceanographer instead. And turns out that was the perfect direction on my journey, because I really love the ocean and everything that I've learned about it. And just for 10 years, I was doing science, but also writing and working on my craft, and acknowledging that a lot of my drafts weren't perfect, and I just have to work a little more, and I have to read what I like reading and be inspired. And so it was a long process, and perseverance is what got me here, because if I'd given up when the creative writing program rejected me, then I wouldn't have a That's the Way and A Snake Falls to Earth. And I wouldn't be able to now do my dream job, which I say that I'm always really sad, because I do miss, like, one of my favorite memories was working on a research vessel in the Sargasso Sea. So I do miss a lot of science, but I was like, I've wanted to be a writer since I was like 2 years old.
Great. I think that's a really valuable piece of advice that we can all really learn from and take into account. And I'd also like to touch on how you mentioned that your parents were a big help for you when you were young. Can you remember a specific piece of advice that they helped you that you still carry with you today?
Yeah, I do have to say, it's back to that initial rejection I got from Houghton Mifflin. I actually still I don't have it in my office, but I still have it with me. It's framed. And that's because my dad framed it. And he told me that someday I'd look back and see how far I'd come, and not to give up. And I would say he's the one who taught me the importance of perseverance. So that would be the biggest advice. Another thing, this is kind of, he was a Shakespeare guy. Like, he was an English professor and then later a chair of a writing department in Connecticut. And he studied Marlowe and Shakespearean literature for most of his dissertation and after that. And I remember that he once pulled the quote, "To thine own self be true," and I've always cherished that, just because it showed how he accepted me, who I am, and loved me unconditionally. So I try to be true to myself. Sometimes it's hard, but then I remember that word of advice.
So since Oliver kind of talked about college and advice for students, when you were a student in college, what inspired you to go further and get your PhD and not only stop at your bachelor's?
Oh, that's a good question. So after basically I got my geoscience degree, and I remember I'd been focusing a lot on oceanography, but at Princeton, where I went, there was no, you couldn't get an oceanography undergraduate degree. So I got my bachelor's in geoscience, and I realized that if I wanted to continue focusing on the ocean and maybe doing work specifically I was always interested in biological oceanography, and plankton ended up being my thing, just because I love how they're so small. They're often overlooked. I mean, there's some large plankton, but most of them are little guys. And yet they're so important. They're also potentially one of my instructors when I was getting my bachelor's degree, he was trying to look at how plankton were incorporated in that carbon pump, where CO2 is like, it's absorbed by the surface ocean. He was trying to see, well, how do these plankton potentially help draw it down into the deep ocean where it can be sequestered for a while. So he got me interested into that, and just I realized plankton were super cool, and I couldn't learn much more about them without pursuing a higher degree. And it just turned out that Texas A&M had a pretty easy way to jump straight to your PhD, so I didn't have to get my master's degree. But I did spend a year between my undergrad and my grad school I did an internship looking for, essentially I was working at the Cape Cod National Seashore and helping one of the rangers there develop a program to teach kids about invasive species, or marine invasive species specifically. So I was kind of looking at other options, like maybe I would want to do something like that. But in the end, I realized that I wanted to learn more about my focus interest, which were plankton.
Definitely, you've definitely persevered like throughout your life and your education. Not only did you get your PhD in oceanography, but you're also a very successful author.
Oh,
So on the journey of being both, how were you able to like balance your life?
I did have to eventually acknowledge when I wasn't able to balance both of them. And that kind of happened after my first book had come out, and I'd been taking care of my father. He was in the hospital. And so I had a lot on my plate. And I think that it's always a good thing when you can tell yourself, okay, maybe you need to take that step back. Maybe you're overworking. And for me, even though it hurt to say goodbye to science, I just had to acknowledge that I was only one person. But before that, I would focus on my science work and do my writing in my free time. And I think what's important there is that I didn't force myself to write every day or do something like, I have to write in the morning for an hour, because that would just cause more stress. So what I did instead is I would write only when I felt like doing it as something, as a source of joy, because almost like reading, I did it recreationally. And that's what I tell other people who want to be writers, but who have a full-time job doing whatever else. And sometimes they feel burnt out. And I'm like, don't force yourself to create. That art should make you happier in the long run. And so before I had the chance to focus on full-time writing, I did balance it just by acknowledging that it's okay to take some time off to just rest and do something not related to my writing or to science, like maybe play a video game, something like that, and not to beat myself up over that.
Great, thank you. We just have one more question and then maybe some follow-ups after. But is there anything that like we haven't been able to talk about during this conversation that you'd really love to discuss?
No, these questions have been really, what's the word? They're really insightful. I've really enjoyed answering them as well. So yeah, I can't think of anything.
So I'd like to kind of like take a step back and kind of go back to when you were talking about your book and how a lot of some of your cultural heritage is involved in those books. So do you think it's like a way where you're able to preserve like Lipin Apache?
I've got to say that one really cool thing about it is, so I remember when I was in high school, my teacher, it was 6th grade, and my teacher wanted to know like what type of native I am. And I was like, oh, Lipan Apache. And she actually didn't know what that was. And so I spelled it out for her. And I think she accidentally misspelled it where she Googled it and couldn't find it. I was like, oh no, it's Lipan. And anyway, and what was shocking to me is I went to high school in Texarkana, Texas, and the Lipan Apache, our impact on Texas history is so great that I could not believe that a teacher who was teaching me history had never heard of us. And I think that just shows erasure in work. Like we didn't really learn much about Native people in general. I think mostly the one event we did study was the Trail of Tears, and we didn't even go much into depth with that, but certainly not the type of history that a class in Texas should really be teaching us if we're going to be highlighting Texas history. But now I think that as more people are reading my books, they just know we exist, and I gotta say that's pretty huge for me. That's not something I'm used to, but I like it.
That's crazy. Yeah. I did want to go back to what you were saying about oceanography and all that. What inspired you to major in that, and
Oh
how does
yeah.
that go back to your writing?
Yeah, it's kind of cool. So I went to Princeton, and I guess I'll start from high school. So I applied to a whole bunch of different places, and I applied to the few Ivy League ones just because I thought, why not? Like I didn't expect to get in them. And then when I was accepted at Princeton, it was huge because they give financial aid based on family need. So based on the income of my parents, they covered pretty much everything. So I was going to be able to go to school without debt, which like student debt had my parents actually, we lost our house because of it. So I was just really excited. I was like, "Oh, I get to study writing." And I applied to the creative writing program and they're like, "Nah." So I applied again and they're like, "Nope." And then I realized that after that second rejection, I wouldn't have a chance to focus in writing. But that was the time when I took an introductory to oceanography course because at Princeton, they essentially want all their students to take, like you have to take a humanities and a history class and a science class and a math class. So they want us to be well-versed, interdisciplinary. And it was just pure chance that I decided to do this oceanography course. And first, I'd always grown up in landlocked areas, even in Texas. I was like in Texarkana, so that's far away from the ocean. And so just seeing the ocean for the first time, I was like, "Whoa, this is kind of cool." And then one of our classes went down to Bermuda, and they showed us how to do things like collecting plankton and looking at the depth of the ocean. And we sailed out to the open ocean. It was at least 1,000 meters deep. So this is so far away, you can't see land anymore, and you certainly can't see the bottom of the ocean. Like you look down, it just goes down until darkness, and you know that under your feet is untold mystery. So my professor was like, "Hey, you kids want to go swimming?" And none of us had swimsuits on because we didn't know that we'd be able to go swimming. So we just all jumped in the water with our clothes. And I could swim. Like I learned to swim. I was an okay swimmer, but I didn't do it often, so I was not really a strong swimmer. And something I didn't anticipate was that my jeans were made out of denim, and denim, it absorbs water and gets pretty heavy. So I started struggling to stay afloat, and this probably should have turned me away from studying the ocean, but instead, like that moment of being like, "Oh, whoa, this thing is dragging me down to the mysterious depths, and I don't know anything about it." I kind of fell in love with it. So I wanted to learn more about because the ocean takes up so much of the planet we live on, and it's really influential in terms of things like um, weather patterns on land, and it sustains so many people through the fish that we eat and just like all sorts of things. And I didn't know anything about it, and that drove me to become an oceanographer. Really, just that desire to learn.
That's awesome. Thank you for your time today. We're gonna
Thank
now
you.
let Victor take over, and he's gonna open to Q&A for the whole cohort to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darcie, for answering questions of our cohort. So now I'm going to open the room for Q&A. So if anyone or the rest of our cohort would like to ask Darcie a question, please turn all your cameras on so she can see. Anyone in our cohort would like to ask Darcie questions, please go ahead and turn your camera on so she can see you and you can ask her question.
Actually, I did want to touch on one more thing. It was really interesting. What about you drowning with your jeans on made you want to pursue it?
I don't know if it's because I'm a fan of horror or what. I do think it was that kind of wake up moment when I was wondering what was under me at that time, and also if I would be able to make it back to the ship. So I mean, I guess logically I should have wanted to stay away from the ocean after that, but instead it had the effect of making me more interested and fascinated in it, which I mean, that's kind of unlike me because I don't like roller coasters and I'm sure never going to go like skydiving or anything. So it's not like I love being scared, but just in that instance, it was very intriguing.
Thank you, Hector. Does anybody else have any additional questions or would like to express an opinion or just something anything that comes to mind?
You want to see my dog? I could show them my dog.
Sure.
I'll go get her. She's sleeping on my feet.
Oh, okay.
Come here. There we go. And you can ask her questions too. Oh, I got lipstick on her.
What's your dog's name?
Oh, this is Princess Peach, and we adopted her last week. So my spouse is a veterinarian and does some work with one of our local shelters. So she was dropped off a couple months ago. She had a litter of 6 puppies with her, and the puppies are fine. They're off in their other homes, and so I wanted to adopt little Peach down here. I don't know if you see, one of the vets made her a little peach collar bandana. So yeah, she's gonna be I'm thinking of training her to go on book tour with me because my publisher, this is the first time I'm ever gonna go on book tour this spring because I was published in 2020, which, as you know, we couldn't really do in-person events then. So my first 2 books, I didn't really do a tour. But this year upcoming I'm going to. So I'm like, I wonder if I could train her to come along with me. We'll see.
Well, Darcie, if you decide to stop by California, we will definitely welcome you here at Sacramento Public Library.
Oh, dude. So I moved when I got married a couple of years ago. I moved to the LA area. So it's not too far. I mean,
it's just a 5-hour drive. So we will
yeah,
welcome
hop
you
in the
here.
car. I mean, Texas time, that's a short trip.
It's
At least that's what my mom says. I don't know.
We're more than happy to host you. If you want to just
Oh.
stop by, just come say hi to all of
Oh,
us.
I'd love that. I've got to tell my publisher, because I think California is one of the states they're going to send me through. And then also Cincinnati is okay. So Ohio's got some cities there, and then Texas. So those are the 3 big states.
Well, yeah, definitely. We look forward to see your work and definitely your next book. Is it coming out next year?
Yes, April 16th, 2024. So
Time just flies by, so it goes by super quick. So
yeah, I can't believe it. It still feels like Halloween to me.
yeah, we're just in time for the holidays. Yeah, definitely. So I will open the room one more time. If anybody would like to ask a question to Darcie, now is the time.
One more thing. The other day I was looking at your website, the WordPress, I think.
Oh yeah.
And I was trying to find it right now, one of the archives, but I saw that you went on an ocean trip with your father, I believe.
Was that
and that was really cool.
Was that on the catamaran?
I don't remember exactly details, but I remember seeing a picture of you like on a boat, and you took a picture of the ocean, and you said you took your father on a trip, and that was really cool.
Yeah, I'm trying to
Yeah,
think.
and I want to ask more about that.
That might have been. I'm trying to remember which one it was, because okay, so full disclosure, I'm getting an actual author website because I haven't updated my WordPress in like a few years. So I'm thinking, when did me and Dad go to the ocean? I know that my father-in-law took us on a boat trip around a couple years ago. Oh, and me and my dad visited the beach in Galveston once. If you have a link though, I'll be able to remember. So this is terrible. Like I remember I did an event just last month with some folks down in Iowa, and some of the college students, their assignment was to read the short stories on my blog. And I was like, oh, I have twice as many short stories out now. These are my early ones, and my writing was kind of cringe, and I do need to. So my editor actually said, Darcie, you can't do this anymore. You need an actual website. So I actually responded to the website designer earlier today because he sent me a draft, and I was like, I want it to be retro, like my neon sign. So that's coming soon.
Thank you, Hector. And well, if we don't have any more questions, Darcie, I would definitely want to thank you for being here with us and well, letting us know a little bit more about your story as a writer and as a person. So,
no, that was great, and thank you everyone who interviewed me. Y'all have some really insightful questions, so I could tell you have a promising future.
Well, thank you so much again, and well, for all of us, thank you for being part of this series, and we'll see you next time.